Hannibal Barca needs no introduction. He was Rome's greatest enemy. If warfare truly is an art, then Hannibal was Da Vinci. Even if you don't really know much about Rome, you've probably heard his name at least once. His father, on the other hand, has sunk into the sands of time quite far. Like Philip II of Macedon or Nur al-Din of Syria, Hamilcar Barca was one of those few brilliant figures in history who possessed the right mix of ambition, courage and skill that enabled them to achieve great things, but were unfortunate enough to be succeeded by someone so famous, so brilliant, that they were sadly put in the shade. So that's what this video hopes to achieve, to shed some light on Hamilcar Barca, the father of Hannibal, the conqueror of Spain, and the enemy of Rome. Sadly, we know little about his early life. He was born sometime in the 270s BC in the city of Carthage, just as the wars of the Diadochi were wrapping up in the east, and the rising power of Rome was coming to blows with Pyrrhus of Epirus in the west. It was this latter conflict that allowed Rome to extend its power over all of Italy. By 270, Pyrrhus had been defeated, leaving Rome and Carthage as the two dominant powers in the western Mediterranean. The two powers had been peaceful, even friendly so far. It was not to last. A dispute with some mercenaries led to both Rome and Carthage sending troops to the same city, thus sparking the First Punic War. This then was the backdrop to Hamilcar's early life, the bloodiest war Carthage ever fought. His city had fought plenty of wars against the Greeks of Sicily before, but it quickly became clear that the Romans were a different kettle of fish entirely. Despite never having raised a navy before, they cheerfully set about building a fleet, supposedly after finding a Carthaginian warship washed up on the shore, and furious fighting followed for control of the sea. The Carthaginians, until now the erstwhile masters of the waves, soon found their fleets being routed and their admirals being humiliated by these unyielding landlubbers. Even when the Carthaginians did score victories at sea, or Roman fleets were destroyed by storms, sometimes sending hundreds of thousands to watery graves, the Romans simply rebuilt and returned with newfound ferocity. And if the sea war was going poorly, then the land war was just one continuous disaster. Slowly but surely, the Romans applied pressure to the Carthaginian strongholds, taking them one by one and bottling up Carthage in the west of the island, with only two major cities, Lilybaeum and Drepana, as their last bastions. By 247 BC, the war had dragged on for 17 years, and a Roman victory loomed larger with every passing year. Defeatism was in the air. The anti-war party in Carthage was gaining ground. This, when combined with the immense financial cost of the war, meant that by 247 the amount of resources being poured into the war, and especially the land war, was shrinking. So by the time Hamilcar was first posted to the island that same year, he didn't have much to work with. It was also in 247 that Hamilcar's first son, Hannibal, was born. Their last name, Barca, means lightning bolt in Punic, and it soon became clear that the Barcids had a flair for warfare. But unfortunately, Hamilcar's efforts were hamstrung by the lack of troops at his disposal. As a result, for the 6 years he spent on Sicily, he conducted a well-organised but ultimately unsuccessful guerrilla war against Rome, skirmishing here and there while winning a few minor victories. In 244, he trapped a small Roman force at a place called Eryx and besieged it until the end of the war, which was not long in coming. The sucker punch finally came in 241. Rome defeated Carthage's fleet for the last time, and the city finally capitulated. Hamilcar was empowered to broker a peace treaty with the Romans, but the general was not eager to be associated with defeats and humiliating peace treaties, so he therefore delegated the negotiations to his subordinates. And where his reputation was concerned, this was perhaps a wise choice, for the peace treaty was not a pretty sight. In short, Carthage had to abandon Sicily, while simultaneously paying a huge war indemnity of 2,200 talents of silver. Hamilcar's army remained undefeated, and he was deeply unhappy with what he viewed as an unnecessary peace. It would fuel his resentment of both Rome and the established aristocracy at home. After 23 bloody years and tens if not hundreds of thousands of casualties, the war was over at last. And then the Carthaginians messed it up, and they messed it up by failing to follow the oldest rule in the book: pay your troops on time. In light of Carthage's tight economic situation, the Carthaginian Senate delayed the long overdue payments of arrears once more, hoping to negotiate a better deal. The veteran mercenaries were outraged at the stinginess of their masters, and tensions rapidly rose. The Carthaginians must have stopped smoking whatever drugs they were on, because they suddenly woke up to the danger of having 20,000 unpaid murder machines on their doorstep. Their bravado disintegrated and they agreed to pay up, but they had gone too far now. The mercenaries realised their bargaining power and kept upping the money required, bleeding their former masters dry and increasing the resentment even further. Then the negotiations came to an abrupt halt. The disgruntled Libyan contingent of the army rose in revolt. The Carthaginians wouldn't have to fork over any silver after all. Instead, they had haggled themselves a price in blood. It was the sizable Libyan contingent that sparked the revolt, and these Libyan soldiers were able to call on their countrymen from the interior. The Carthaginians had levied heavy taxes to fund the war with Rome, and the disgruntled peasantry eagerly jumped at the chance to overthrow their Punic masters. It was in this conflict, the so-called mercenary war, that Hamilcar was able to shine as a general. The mercenary leaders didn't have much experience of high-level command, so Hamilcar was able to run rings around them. Yet while Hamilcar was desperately fighting to hold back the tide in Africa, wars also blazed in Sardinia. Much like in Africa, Carthaginian mercenaries revolted and broke away from central control. Attempts to restore control failed, and the Sardinian mercenaries appealed to Rome for help. The Romans had thus far behaved with the utmost honour, banning trade with the rebels and releasing their Carthaginian prisoners without the need for a ransom. The Romans rejected the mercenaries' appeals, but when the mercenaries were ousted from the island by the native Sardinians in 237, they fled to Italy, where they once again begged the Senate for help. For some reason, there seems to have been a sudden upsurge in opportunism, for this time the Romans accepted and sent troops to annex Sardinia and Corsica. This shameless act of backstabbing engendered much hatred towards the Romans. Sure, Carthage had suffered more in the First Punic War, but at least Rome had beaten them fair and square. This act of opportunistic adventuring was never forgotten by the Carthaginians, and Hamilcar's hatred of Rome was doubtlessly increased as well. Yet for all her outrage, Carthage could do nothing. They had been fighting constantly for 27 years now, and they were on the brink of exhaustion. Adding insult to injury, the Romans also enforced an increase of 1,200 talents on the war indemnity. Anyways, as the Sardinian affair was wrapping up, Hamilcar was beating back the rebels, boxing them in with adroit diplomacy and wily tactics. By 237, the mercenaries had been crushed and their leaders crucified Crassus style. The Carthaginians then let out one long sigh of relief. Their city had survived. Barely, just barely, but it had survived, and Hamilcar had a large part to play. However, it now owed Rome 3,400 talents of silver, money that had to be found somewhere, and money that Carthage simply didn't have. So, desperate for silver, the cash-strapped Carthaginians authorised an invasion of Spain to be led by their foremost general, Hamilcar Barca. The Phoenicians, from whom the Carthaginians were descended, had possessed outposts in Spain since before 1000 BC, and the Carthaginians had always had an interest in the wildlands of the Iberian Peninsula. Southern Spain possessed many rich silver mines, and Hamilcar spent the next decade leading a series of conquests up and down the peninsula, driving hard into the heart of Iberia, thrashing the native tribes, and pushing the boundaries of Carthaginian power up to the north. He brought with him an eclectic band of mercenaries, but over the years Hamilcar forged them into a crack force of troops, loyal personally to the Barcid name. It was in 231 BC that a Roman embassy rocked up in Spain to inquire about Hamilcar's plans and what exactly he thought he was doing. Hamilcar merely replied that he was gaining the plunder to pay off the war indemnity. The Romans couldn't argue with that and left for home. The conquest of Spain brought Carthage to the second apex of its power, with the Spanish silver mines adding a fresh influx of wealth to the bedraggled state. A good chunk of Iberia had been conquered, but, unfortunately for him, his plans of expansion would be brought to an abrupt end in 229 BC. He was ambushed or otherwise attacked by the leader of the Oritani tribe, and in the ensuing struggle he was struck dead. He was succeeded at first by his son-in-law Hasdrubal, but his death in 221 meant that control of the army went to Hamilcar's 26-year-old son Hannibal. Across his life, he had proven himself a formidable defender of his city's interests, fighting Romans, rebels and Iberians to varying degrees of success. Another important legacy was the army he left Hannibal. What had once been a disparate band of mercenaries had been thoroughly blooded and moulded into a fiercely disciplined fighting force. It would in time serve as the core of Hannibal's invasion force, and was present when he dealt Rome its most stinging defeats. And where Hannibal was concerned, the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Hamilcar's son was every bit the warrior his father had been. According to legend, Hamilcar made his son swear a blood oath, solemnly promising never to be a friend of Rome. And whether this story is true or not, Hannibal would certainly make good on the oath. And in good time, Hannibal would bring the Romans to their knees, and shake the foundations of the Republic to its core. If you like the video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. It really does go a long way to making this more worthwhile and encourages me to keep making history videos.